In 1980, 4 village nuns from Northern California mysteriously vanished without a trace, leaving their close-knit community hollow with grief and uneasy speculation. But 28 years later, the priest makes a shocking discovery, uncovering the horrifying truth about what really happened to them. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Agnes of Mercy Catholic Church, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the polished wooden pews. Father Elias Maro stood at the altar, his voice solemn yet steady as he concluded the memorial prayer service. "May the souls of the departed through the mercy of God rest in peace," he intoned, making the sign of the cross before him. "Amen." The congregation responded in unison. Father Elias looked out at the assembled faces, many elderly, some middle-aged, and a few younger parishioners. All had gathered on this somber day to remember the 4 nuns who had vanished without a trace exactly 28 years ago. The mystery had haunted the small town of Elden Hollow, Northern California, for nearly 3 decades now. As the service ended, Father Elias moved to the church entrance, greeting each member of the congregation as they filed out. Many offered condolences, though after 28 years, the words had taken on a ritualistic quality rather than carrying the raw emotion of fresh grief. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Harmon," Father Elias said, clasping the elderly woman's wrinkled hands in his own. "Your presence means a great deal." "I always come, Father," she replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can still remember Sister Mildred teaching my children their catechism. Such a gentle soul." "Father," Elias nodded, feeling the familiar pang of sorrow. Sister Mildred Hayes had been 68 when she disappeared, a lifetime of service to God cut short by whatever tragedy had befallen her and the other 3 nuns. One by one, the parishioners departed, each carrying a different memory of the missing women. Sister Mildred Hayes, 68, Sister Joan Keller, 65, Sister Beatrice Namora, 28, and the youngest, Sister Teresa Maro, 23. For Father Elias, the wound ran deepest. Sister Teresa had been his biological sister, and her disappearance had shaken his faith to its core. When the last of the congregation had left, Father Elias slowly made his way back through the now empty church. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he moved toward his private office at the rear of the building. The space was modestly furnished, with a simple desk, a bookshelf filled with theological texts, and a window overlooking the church cemetery. Alone at last, Father Elias sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The composed facade he maintained for his parishioners crumbled away, leaving only a man consumed by grief and unanswered questions. "Why, Lord?" he whispered, his voice ragged with emotion. "I have served you faithfully all these years. My sister dedicated her life to you. Why have you not led me to them? What lesson am I failing to learn from this trial?" Tears leaked between his fingers as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. He rarely allowed himself this moment of weakness, but the anniversary always stripped away his carefully constructed defenses. After several minutes, Father Elias drew a deep breath and wiped his eyes. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a small wooden box. Inside lay several photographs, preserved with loving care despite the passage of years. The first was of Teresa on the day she took her final vows. Her young face beamed with joy and purpose beneath her veil, and Father Elias felt both pride and a stab of guilt as he gazed at the image. He had been the one to nurture her faith, to encourage her vocation. He could still remember their conversations when she was just 16, her eyes alight with conviction as she spoke of her calling. "I was so proud of you," he murmured to the photograph. "I still am." The thought that had haunted him for 28 years crept into his mind. If he hadn't encouraged her religious vocation, would she still be here today? Would she be a mother, a teacher, alive and well instead of... "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," Father Elias said sharply, making the sign of the cross to banish the treacherous thought. He could not allow himself to question God's plan, even in his darkest moments. Setting aside Teresa's photograph, he reached for another, the last known image of the 4 missing nuns. They sat together on a wooden bench outside the small remote St. Denis Chapel near the edge of Shasta Trinity National Forest. Sister Mildred and Sister Joan, the eldest, sat with their hands folded placidly in their laps, their lined faces serene. Sister Beatrice sat beside them, her posture more relaxed, but her expression reverent. And beside her was Teresa, the youngest, her eyes bright with purpose even in the faded photograph. The photograph had been taken by a local visitor just days before the nuns disappeared. They had traveled to St. Denis Chapel for a short spiritual retreat, 2 days of fasting, prayer, and silence before the feast of a Catholic saint. The diocese had also tasked them with assessing the old chapel's condition to determine whether it should be restored or decommissioned. Sister Teresa, with her eye for detail, had been asked to document the state of the structure. Father Elias stared at the image, his mind drifting to calculations he'd made countless times before. Sister Mildred would be 96 now. Sister Joan, 93. Even if by some miracle they had survived whatever befell them, they would be frail, ancient women. But Beatrice would be 56, and Teresa just 51, still potentially in the prime of life. He remembered the frantic days and weeks after their disappearance. The police had searched the forest extensively, combing through underbrush and scaling the nearby mountainsides. Search parties had spread out through surrounding farms, villages, and towns. But not a single clue had emerged. No scraps of clothing, no personal effects, no signs of struggle. It was as if the 4 women had simply vanished into thin air. The official theory had eventually settled on a bear attack. The Shasta Trinity National Forest was known for its wildlife, including black bears that could become aggressive if threatened. Perhaps the sisters had wandered too far into the woods and encountered a predator, but the complete absence of evidence had always made this explanation feel hollow to Father Elias, and to many others as well. Over the years, uglier rumors had circulated, whispers that the nuns had abandoned their vows and run away to start new lives. Father Elias and the church had worked tirelessly to quash such speculation, but the seeds of doubt had been planted in the community nonetheless. Teresa would never have done that, he whispered, tracing his sister's face in the photograph. She would never have left without telling me. As he continued to gaze at the photograph, his eyes drifted to the chapel in the background. St. Denis had been a simple structure, constructed in the 1920s to serve the scattered Catholic population in the area. Its white walls and modest bell tower were visible behind the nuns, surrounded by the looming trees of the forest edge. Something tugged at Father Elias's heart as he studied the building. He hadn't visited St. Denis in over 20 years, finding the memories too painful to bear. But now, on this anniversary, he felt a strange urge to see it again, to walk where his sister had walked, to pray where she had prayed. Perhaps it was mere sentimentality, a desire to feel close to Teresa on this difficult day, or perhaps a small voice whispered in the back of his mind that there was still something to be discovered there, some clue overlooked in the initial investigation. The latter thought was almost certainly foolish. What could possibly remain to be found after 28 years? Yet the pull was undeniable. Father Elias carefully replaced the photographs in the box, except for the one of the 4 nuns at St. Denis, which he slipped into his pocket. He rose from his desk, collected his Bible and rosary, and left his office, with purpose in his stride. In the church parking lot, he slid behind the wheel of his modest sedan, placed the photograph on the passenger seat beside him, and said a brief prayer for guidance. Then he turned the key in the ignition and pulled away from St. Agnes, heading toward the forest and the ghosts of his past. The winding road leading from Elden Hollow to the Shasta Trinity National Forest carried Father Elias through changing landscapes. The town's neat houses and businesses gave way to scattered farms, which eventually surrendered to the encroaching wilderness. Tall pines and cedars crowded the roadside, their shadows dappling the asphalt as he drove. The journey took approximately an hour and a half, giving Father Elias ample time to reflect. He found himself recalling the numerous times he had made the same drive in the weeks following the nuns' disappearance. Back then, his car had been filled with missing person flyers bearing Teresa's face, and his heart had been buoyed by desperate hope. Now he carried only memories and a resigned acceptance of the mystery that had shaped his life. As the road narrowed and began to climb into the foothills, Father Elias slowed his vehicle. St. Denis Chapel had been situated in a small clearing near the forest edge, accessible via a modest dirt road that branched off from the main highway. He scanned the roadside, looking for the familiar turnoff. When he reached what he believed to be the correct location, Father Elias frowned in confusion. Instead of the simple dirt path he remembered, he found a paved private road blocked by an ornate gate. A no trespassing sign was displayed alongside smaller notices warning of private property. "This can't be right," he muttered, pulling his car to the side of the road. He consulted the photograph he had brought, comparing the background landscape to what he could see from his position. The mountains in the distance matched, as did the particular arrangement of taller trees on the ridgeline. This was indeed the correct location. But where was St. Denis Chapel? Father Elias exited his vehicle and approached the gate on foot. Beyond it, he could see the private road stretching into the forest, but there was no sign of the white chapel building. Instead, the area appeared to have been extensively landscaped, with ornamental trees and shrubs lining the driveway. Bewildered, he reached for his cell phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Harold Gibbons, the longtime caretaker of St. Denis. They hadn't spoken in years, but Father Elias hoped the man might still be in the area and able to provide some explanation. The phone rang several times before a gruff voice answered. "Hello? Harold, this is Father Elias Maro from St. Agnes in Elden Hollow." There was a pause, then recognition. "Father Elias, it's been quite some time. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you," Father Elias replied, though it wasn't entirely true. "Harold, I'm standing at what I believe to be the entrance to St. Denis, but the chapel appears to be gone." Another pause, longer this time. "That's right, Father. The diocese decommissioned the chapel years ago. It was sold in 1982 to a man named Silas Redwood. He demolished it." Father Elias felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. "I never heard anything about the chapel being sold, let alone demolished." "Well, after what happened with the nuns, attendance dropped off significantly. Then there was that incident with the bell tower cracking and nearly injuring poor Thomas Frell. The bishop decided it wasn't worth the upkeep for such a small congregation." Father Elias found himself staring at the no trespassing sign, with growing unease. "This Silas Redwood, does he still own the property?" "Oh yes," Harold confirmed. "He's got quite a spread back there. His main house is a ways in, near where the forest gets thicker. The chapel site is just part of his estate now." "I see," Father Elias said slowly. "I had hoped to visit the chapel today for personal reasons. It's the anniversary, you know." Harold's voice softened with understanding. "Of course. It's been 28 years today, hasn't it? I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing, Father. Do you know if Mr. Redwood is generally receptive to visitors? Perhaps if I explain the situation." "To be honest, he's not known for his hospitality," Harold replied cautiously. "Bit of a recluse from what I hear. Keeps to himself. Doesn't mix much with the locals." Father Elias sighed, disappointment settling heavily on his shoulders. "Well, thank you for the information, Harold. I appreciate it." "Listen, Father," Harold said, his tone brightening slightly. "I still live nearby, not 15 minutes from where you are now. I saved some items from the chapel when it was decommissioned. The old altar cross, some prayer books, things like that. You're welcome to come see them if you'd like." "That's very kind of you," Father Elias replied. "Perhaps I will, but first, I think I'd like to try speaking with Mr. Redwood. Do you know how I might reach his main house?" Harold hesitated. "Well, there's the private road you're looking at, but that gate's always locked. There's a public road that loops around, though. It'll take you near enough to the property." After receiving directions from Harold, Father Elias thanked him and ended the call. He returned to his car, conflicted about his next move. Part of him felt he should respect Silas Redwood's privacy and head straight to Harold's home instead. But a stronger impulse propelled him toward the public road that would lead to Redwood's estate. 20 minutes later, Father Elias found himself driving along a narrow lane that skirted the edge of what must have been Redwood's property. Through gaps in the trees, he caught glimpses of manicured grounds and eventually a substantial structure that resembled a mountain lodge. More than a conventional house, The building was impressive. 3 stories of natural stone and timber, with expansive windows and multiple terraces overlooking the forest. It spoke of wealth that seemed at odds with the modest rural surroundings. Father Elias located a small parking area near what appeared to be a service entrance to the property. He parked his car, straightened his clerical collar, and approached the imposing residence with a mixture of determination and apprehension. As he neared the front entrance, a stone pathway led him past carefully tended gardens and a small decorative pond. The craftsmanship of the place was undeniable, yet Father Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of disquiet. He climbed the steps to the front door and knocked firmly on the heavy oak panel. The door swung open almost immediately, revealing a tall, athletic man in his 60s, dressed in expensive exercise attire. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and in one hand he held a leather dog leash. The man's expression shifted from neutral expectation to unmistakable displeasure as he registered Father Elias's clerical attire. "Yes?" he asked, not bothering to disguise the impatience in his tone. "Good afternoon," Father Elias said with a warm smile. "Are you Mr. Silas Redwood?" The man's jaw tightened. "I am, and you are trespassing on private property. I apologize for arriving unannounced. My name is Father Elias Maro from St. Agnes of Mercy Church in Elden Hollow." He extended his hand, but Silas Redwood made no move to take it. "What do you want?" Redwood demanded, his fingers tightening around the dog leash. Father Elias lowered his hand, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the hostility. "I was hoping I might have a few minutes of your time. You see, I visited the site where St. Denis Chapel used to stand, and I was surprised to find it gone. If you already saw it's not there, why come bothering me?" Redwood's voice had taken on an edge that was almost a snarl. "I spoke with Harold Gibbons, the former caretaker. He mentioned you had purchased the property. I simply wanted to..." "To what? Blame me for buying land that was for sale?" Redwood stepped forward aggressively, causing Father Elias to take an involuntary step back. "Are you one of those who thinks that ground is somehow sacred? The diocese didn't think so when they sold it." No, Father Elias said, quickly raising his hands in a placating gesture. "I don't blame you at all. I was just curious about the circumstances. The chapel held personal significance for me, and I wasn't aware it had been demolished." Redwood seemed momentarily mollified, though his expression remained cold. "Well, now you know. It's gone. And good riddance. I sleep better now, that I don't have to hear that blasted bell ringing 3 times a day and giving me migraines." Father Elias couldn't help but respond to this. "The Angelus bell is a beautiful tradition, Mr. Redwood. It calls the faithful to recite the Lord's Prayer and honors the incarnation of God. It's meant to be a reminder of holy things, of our freedom from sin and death." "Oh, spare me the sermon," Redwood scoffed. "People can set alarms on their phones if they need reminding to pray. They don't need to disturb the entire countryside with medieval noise pollution." The conversation was clearly not progressing in a positive direction. Father Elias decided to try a different approach. "I understand you value your privacy, Mr. Redwood, and I've intruded on your time. I apologize for that. Perhaps we could speak another day when it's more convenient for you." "There won't be another day," Redwood said flatly. "I have no interest in discussing a building that hasn't existed for decades with a priest I've never met before. Now, I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff and report you for trespassing." Father Elias nodded, recognizing the futility of continuing. "Very well. Thank you for your time, Mr. Redwood. Peace be with you." Redwood's only response was to close the door firmly in his face. With a heavy sigh, Father Elias turned and made his way back down the stone path toward his car. The encounter had left him feeling both disappointed and unsettled. There had been something in Redwood's manner, beyond mere rudeness, that suggested a deeper antipathy toward the church and its representatives. As he reached his vehicle, Father Elias glanced back at the imposing house. Was it merely his imagination, or was Redwood watching him from one of the upper windows? The sensation of being observed prickled at the back of his neck. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, torn between returning to Elden Hollow and stopping at Harold Gibbons's home, as the man had invited him to do. Perhaps seeing some of the preserved items from St. Denis would provide the closure he had sought by coming here today. As he drove away from Redwood's estate, Father Elias found himself taking the road that would pass near the former site of the chapel. He couldn't explain the compulsion. After all, he now knew there was nothing to see. But something drew him back in that direction. The car rounded a bend, bringing him within view of the approximate location where St. Denis had once stood. Through a gap in the trees, he could make out a cleared area where the small building had been, now landscaped with ornamental shrubs. Suddenly, the car's radio crackled to life, emitting a strange, haunting sound. Father Elias started, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. The sound was unmistakable, Gregorian chant, the ancient ethereal music of monastic worship. But the radio was off. He distinctly remembered turning it off when he left Elden Hollow. Father Elias pulled the car to the side of the road and stared at the radio in bewilderment. The chanting continued for several seconds, then faded away as abruptly as it had begun. "What on earth?" he murmured, reaching out to touch the radio dial. He turned it on and then off again, but the mysterious chanting did not return. Had he imagined it? A trick of an exhausted mind, perhaps? Or some strange electrical malfunction in his aging vehicle? Yet, as he sat there, a peculiar sensation washed over him, the same feeling he had experienced earlier while looking at the photograph in his office. A tugging at his heart, an inexplicable certainty that he was meant to be here, now, for a purpose he did not yet understand. The hair on his arms stood on end, and a warmth spread through his chest. Physical sensations he had experienced before in moments of intense prayer or spiritual insight. In seminary, his spiritual director had taught him to recognize these as potential movements of the Holy Spirit. Once more, the faint chanting emanated from the silent radio, and this time, Father Elias was certain he wasn't imagining it. It was as if an otherworldly voice was calling to him, guiding him. Without fully understanding his own actions, Father Elias executed a careful U-turn and drove back toward the gate that blocked access to the former chapel site. Whatever was happening, he felt compelled to investigate further, even if it meant risking another confrontation with the unwelcoming Silas Redwood. Father Elias parked his car on the side of the road near the gate that marked the entrance to Silas Redwood's property. The no trespassing signs loomed before him, their warnings clear and unambiguous. He sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, questioning the wisdom of what he was contemplating. "Lord, guide my actions," he whispered. "If I am about to err in judgment, show me the right path." But the strange sensation of spiritual prompting persisted, and after a final moment of hesitation, Father Elias exited his vehicle. He approached the gate cautiously, fully aware that he was considering trespassing on private property, an action difficult to reconcile with his moral obligations as a priest. Yet the mysterious chanting from his radio had awakened something in him, a conviction that transcended ordinary concerns. Rather than attempting to breach the gate itself, Father Elias began to walk along the perimeter fence, seeking a vantage point from which to view the former chapel site. The fence was substantial, 8 feet of ornate but sturdy metal, but it followed the contours of the uneven forest terrain, occasionally dipping closer to the ground where the land rose beneath it. As he walked, Father Elias closed his eyes briefly, trying to visualize the layout of St. Denis as it had once been. If his memory served him correctly, the wooden bench where the nuns had been photographed had stood to the east of the chapel, near a large oak tree. Opening his eyes, he scanned the property beyond the fence, attempting to locate landmarks that might have survived the demolition. The oak tree was gone, presumably removed during Redwood's renovations, but a cluster of pines that had stood behind the chapel remained, providing a reference point. Father Elias continued along the fence line, moving toward the area where he believed the chapel had stood. As he walked, his foot suddenly caught on an exposed tree root, sending him stumbling forward. He reached out to catch himself, his hands grasping the metal fence, but the momentum of his fall caused his weight to press against a section where the fence posts were set in uneven ground. There was a sharp cracking sound as the weakened joint of the fence gave way, creating a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. Father Elias found himself sprawled partially onto Redwood's property, the broken section of fence beneath him. "Oh, dear Lord," he muttered, picking himself up and brushing soil from his clothes. He had not intended to damage the fence, let alone create a means of entry onto the private land. Yet here he was, faced with an unexpected opportunity, or temptation. Father Elias glanced back toward the road, ensuring no one had witnessed his accidental vandalism. The area was deserted, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the afternoon breeze. He looked down at the broken fence, then at the clearing beyond where St. Denis had once stood. "Forgive me," he whispered, crossing himself before carefully stepping through the gap in the fence. Once on Redwood's property, Father Elias moved swiftly but cautiously toward the former chapel site. The area had been landscaped with non-native ornamental plants that seemed out of place against the backdrop of the natural forest. Nothing remained to indicate that a place of worship had ever existed here. No foundation stones, no cross, no memorial of any kind. The absence struck Father Elias as particularly sad. It was as if Silas Redwood had deliberately erased all traces of the chapel's existence, removing not just the building, but its very memory from the land. As he stood, contemplating this, a flash of reflected light caught his eye, something near the ground, partially hidden by decorative shrubbery. Curious, Father Elias moved closer and parted the branches to reveal a metal grate set into the earth, an air vent of some kind. It appeared old and weathered, its iron bars rusted with age. Father Elias frowned, perplexed. If the chapel had been completely demolished, why would an old air vent remain? And why would a landscaped area with no structures need ventilation at all? He crouched beside the vent, examining it more closely. The design was vintage, possibly dating back to the 1930s or 40s, with ornate scrollwork around its edges. It seemed incongruous with the modern minimalist aesthetic of Redwood's property. As he leaned closer, a sound drifted up through the grate, so faint that at first Father Elias thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, a soft, melodic humming followed by what sounded distinctly like a human cough. Father Elias's blood ran cold. The humming was reminiscent of the Gregorian chant he had heard on his car radio, but this was no electrical glitch or figment of his imagination. Someone was below ground, beneath what had once been St. Denis Chapel. "Hello?" he called softly, through the grate, but the humming continued uninterrupted, suggesting the person couldn't hear him from their subterranean location. Father Elias straightened up, his mind racing. The implications were disturbing. Why would there be an underground space beneath the former chapel site? And more importantly, who was down there? He looked around, half expecting to see Silas Redwood approaching with fury in his eyes, but the property remained quiet and apparently unmonitored, at least in this section. The main house was hidden from view by a stand of trees, and no security cameras were visible in the immediate vicinity. Drawing his cell phone from his pocket, Father Elias dialed 911, his hand trembling slightly as he raised the device to his ear. 911, what's your emergency? A dispatcher's voice answered. My name is Father Elias Maro, he said, keeping his voice low despite the apparent solitude. I'm at the property of Silas Redwood, near the former site of St. Denis Chapel off Route 37. He hesitated, suddenly aware of how strange his report would sound. I believe someone may be trapped underground. I can hear singing and coughing coming from an air vent. There was a brief silence on the other end. Sir, are you saying you suspect someone is being held against their will? I don't know, Father Elias admitted, but there appears to be an underground space of some kind, and someone is definitely down there. Given the remote location and the fact that this property is private, I'm concerned. Are you on the property legally, sir? The dispatcher asked, a note of skepticism entering her voice. Father Elias winced. I accidentally damaged a section of fence and found myself on the property. I realize I'm trespassing, but this seemed like an emergency situation. I understand. What is your exact location on the property? Father Elias described his position as best he could, explaining that he was near where St. Denis Chapel had formerly stood, "We'll send officers to investigate," the dispatcher assured him. "Please remain where you are until they arrive, unless you feel you're in danger." "Thank you," Father Elias replied, relief washing over him. "I'll wait by my vehicle, which is parked on the roadside near the main gate." After ending the call, Father Elias took one last look at the mysterious air vent. The humming had stopped, but as he listened intently, he could still hear occasional sounds of movement from below. Someone was definitely down there, and the thought sent a chill down his spine. He made his way back to the broken section of fence, carefully squeezing through the gap and returning to the public road. As he walked toward his parked car, he dialed Harold Gibbons's number, feeling an urgent need to gather more information before the police arrived. "Harold, it's Father Elias again. I need to ask you something important. When St. Denis was still standing, was there any kind of basement or underground room beneath it?" Harold sounded surprised by the question. "No, Father. The chapel was built on a simple slab foundation. No basement, no crypt, nothing like that. Why do you ask?" Father Elias explained what he had discovered, the air vent and the sounds coming from below ground. "That's impossible," Harold said firmly. "There was never any underground structure at St. Denis. I maintained that property for 20 years. I would know." "Then the only explanation is that someone built it after the chapel was demolished," Father Elias concluded. "When Silas Redwood took ownership." "That's disturbing," Harold admitted. "What are you going to do?" "I've already called the police. They're sending officers to investigate." "I'll come too," Harold decided. "I know that property better than anyone. I can be there in 10 minutes. Father Elias thanked him and ended the call, then settled into his car to wait, fingering his rosary beads and murmuring prayers for whoever might be trapped beneath the earth where St. Denis had once stood. Father Elias sat in his parked car, fingers moving methodically over the smooth beads of his rosary as he recited the familiar prayers. The ritual brought a measure of calm to his troubled mind, though questions continued to swirl beneath the surface of his concentration. Who could possibly be below ground at the former chapel site? What purpose could an underground chamber serve in such a remote location? And most disturbing of all, could there be any connection to the disappearance of the 4 nuns 28 years ago? The last question seemed far-fetched, even to Father Elias. 28 years was an impossibly long time for anyone to remain concealed. Yet the timing of his discovery, on the very anniversary of the disappearance, struck him as more than mere coincidence. A vehicle approaching from the direction of town interrupted his thoughts. It was a battered pickup truck that Father Elias recognized as belonging to Harold Gibbons. The former caretaker pulled up behind his sedan and emerged from the cab, his weathered face etched with concern. "Father Elias," Harold called as he approached. "Any sign of the police yet?" "Not yet," Father Elias replied, stepping out to greet him. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Harold nodded, his eyes scanning the road and the gated entrance to Redwood's property. "Been thinking about what you told me. It makes no sense. If Redwood built something underground where the chapel stood, people would have noticed the construction. You can't exactly dig a basement without heavy equipment." "Unless it was done gradually over time," Father Elias suggested. "Or perhaps there was already some natural cavity in the ground that he expanded." Harold shook his head doubtfully. "This area doesn't have caves or anything like that. It's mostly solid bedrock beneath a few feet of soil." Before they could speculate further, the distinctive sound of approaching sirens reached them. A police cruiser rounded the bend, lights flashing but siren fading as it pulled up in front of Father Elias's car. 2 officers emerged, one older, with graying hair at his temples, the other younger and lean, with an alertness in his movements that suggested a military background. Their badges identified them as officers from the Shasta County Sheriff's Department. "Father Maro?" the older officer asked, approaching with a professional but not unfriendly demeanor. "Yes, officer. Thank you for coming." Father Elias gestured to his companion. "This is Harold Gibbons, the former caretaker of St. Denis Chapel that once stood on this property." The older officer nodded in acknowledgement. "I'm Deputy Williams, and this is Deputy Reynolds. Dispatch says you reported hearing sounds coming from an underground location on private property. Can you walk us through exactly what you discovered?" Father Elias explained the circumstances that had brought him to the area. his accidental breaching of the fence, and the discovery of the air vent with sounds emanating from below. He was careful to emphasize his contrition for the trespassing, which Deputy Williams acknowledged with a small wave of his hand. "Let's focus on the potential welfare issue first," the deputy said. "If someone is indeed trapped or being held against their will, that takes precedence over a minor trespassing incident." Harold interjected, "I maintained St. Denis for over 20 years before it was sold. There was never any underground structure associated with the chapel. Whatever's there now was built after Silas Redwood took ownership." The younger officer, Deputy Reynolds, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. "Mr. Redwood is a prominent landowner in these parts. These are serious implications." "I understand that," Father Elias said solemnly. "I'm not accusing Mr. Redwood of anything. I'm simply reporting what I heard and expressing concern for whoever might be down there." Deputy Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough. Let's take a look at this air vent you discovered. Mr. Gibbons, since you're familiar with the property, would you mind accompanying us?" "Not at all," Harold agreed. The four men walked toward the damaged section of fence. Father Elias pointed out the gap he had inadvertently created, and they carefully made their way through onto Redwood's property. Father Elias led them to the ornamental shrubbery that partially concealed the air vent. "Here it is," he said, parting the branches to reveal the rusted grate. Deputy Williams crouched beside it, examining the vent with a practiced eye. "This is old craftsmanship. Doesn't match the modern landscaping at all." Deputy Reynolds joined him, shining a flashlight through the grate. "Can't see much. The shaft angles off after about 6 feet. "Listen," Father Elias urged. "Just be quiet for a moment." The four men fell silent, straining to hear any sound from below. For nearly a minute there was nothing but the ambient noise of the forest, birds calling, leaves rustling. Father Elias began to worry that whoever had been below had either moved away from the vent or had fallen silent upon hearing voices above. Then, faintly but distinctly, a woman's voice began to hum. The melody was haunting, archaic, a fragment of sacred music that Father Elias instantly recognized despite its broken, wavering quality. "Salve, Regina," Deputy Williams whispered, a flicker of recognition crossing his weathered features. Harold nodded in confirmation. Yes, the Marian antiphon, sung in monasteries and convents for centuries. The humming continued for several more seconds, then faded, replaced by the sound of labored breathing and a dry, rasping cough. The officers exchanged significant glances. Deputy Reynolds straightened up, his expression now grave. "That's definitely someone down there, and from the sound of that cough they may need medical attention." "We need to speak with Mr. Redwood immediately," Deputy Williams decided. "This is now a welfare check at minimum." "I don't understand," Harold said, shaking his head in bewilderment. "This air vent wasn't here when the chapel stood, and there was never any basement or underground room. How could anyone be down there?" "That's what we aim to find out," Deputy Williams replied, his tone suggesting he had shifted fully into investigative mode. "Let's head to Redwood's residence." The four men made their way back to the road in their respective vehicles. Following the deputy's cruiser, Father Elias and Harold drove the short distance to Silas Redwood's main house. The imposing structure seemed more forbidding than ever as they approached, its many windows like watchful eyes surveying their arrival. Deputy Williams instructed Father Elias and Harold to remain by their vehicles while he and Deputy Reynolds approached the front door. Father Elias watched as the officers knocked and waited, tension evident in their postures despite their professional demeanor. Several moments passed before the door opened, but it wasn't Silas Redwood who emerged. Instead, the group saw him approaching from the rear of the property, still dressed in his exercise clothes and leading a large German shepherd on a leash. His expression shifted rapidly from polite inquiry to barely contained fury when he spotted Father Elias and Harold standing near the officer's cruiser. "What is the meaning of this?" Redwood demanded as he reached the front steps. "Why are these trespassers on my property again?" Deputy Williams introduced himself and his partner, explaining the purpose of their visit in measured tones. "We received a report of sounds coming from what appears to be an underground structure at the former chapel site. We'd like to ask you a few questions about that, sir. Redwood's face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. First, this priest shows up uninvited, trespasses through my fence and onto my land, and now he's making wild accusations and wasting police resources. No one is making accusations, Mr. Redwood, Deputy Reynolds said calmly. We're simply following up on a welfare concern. Someone appears to be in an underground space on your property, and they sound like they may need medical attention. That's absurd, Redwood snapped. There's no one on my property except me and my dogs. I would know if someone were living in a secret underground bunker? Do you realize how ridiculous that sounds? Nevertheless, sir, we're obligated to investigate, Deputy Williams said firmly. We'd like permission to check your home and the grounds, including any basement areas. Absolutely not. Redwood's hand tightened on the dog's leash, causing the animal to shift restlessly. This is private property. You have no right to search without a warrant. Mr. Redwood, Deputy Reynolds began, his tone reasonable, but insistent. If there's someone in distress on your property, even a trespasser you're unaware of, wouldn't you want to know about it? This could be a squatter who's found their way into some old structure you don't even know exists. Redwood's eyes narrowed suspiciously. There are no old structures I don't know about. I've owned this land for over 25 years. I know every inch of it. Then what about the air vent near the former chapel site? Deputy Williams asked. The one that appears to ventilate an underground space. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Redwood's expression, a momentary faltering, that Father Elias caught before the man's face hardened once more into obstinate refusal. I installed a drainage system when I landscaped that area, Redwood said dismissively. What you're calling an air vent is probably just a decorative grate covering a drain pipe. There's nothing sinister about it. A drainage system doesn't sing hymns or cough, Mr. Redwood, Deputy Williams observed dryly. Redwood turned, his glare toward Father Elias. This man has clearly orchestrated this entire situation. He probably brought some device that plays recorded sounds and planted it near the drain. He's harassing me because he resents that I bought church property. I would never do such a thing, Father Elias protested, crossing himself. As God is my witness, I heard a woman's voice coming from that vent. We all heard it just now. Redwood scoffed. A priest invoking God while trespassing and lying. How very typical. That's enough, Mr. Redwood, Deputy Williams said sharply. We're asking for your voluntary cooperation. If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to pursue other legal avenues. Then pursue them, Redwood replied coldly. In the meantime, I want these people off my property immediately. If they're not gone in 2 minutes, I'll file trespassing charges against all of you. Recognizing the impasse, Deputy Williams nodded to Father Elias and Harold, indicating they should return to their vehicles. The officers followed, walking back to their cruiser with measured steps that suggested this retreat was strategic rather than final. As they reached the police, Car Deputy Williams spoke quietly to Father Elias. Don't worry, Father. This isn't over. I'm going to contact dispatch and request information on the property deed, ownership history, and any prior complaints or incidents at this location. I also want to review the file on those missing nuns from 1980. Something's not right here. Father Elias nodded gratefully. Thank you, Deputy. I know how strange this must seem, but I truly believe someone needs help down there. I believe you. We all heard something, the deputy replied. Whether it's exactly what you think, we'll determine that with a proper investigation. Head back to Harold's place for now. We'll be in touch. The drive to Harold's home was brief but tense, with both men lost in their thoughts about the mysterious voice beneath the former chapel grounds. Harold's house proved to be a modest cabin set back from the main road, surrounded by towering pines that cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Not much, but it's home, Harold said as he led Father Elias inside. The interior was simply furnished but comfortable, with well-worn furniture and walls decorated with fishing memorabilia and a few framed photographs. It's very welcoming, Father Elias replied sincerely, noting the cross hanging prominently above the stone fireplace. Harold busied himself in the small kitchen, preparing tea, while Father Elias settled into an armchair. I kept several items from St. Denis. When it was decommissioned, Harold called over his shoulder. They're in a trunk in the spare room. I'll show you after we've had our tea. Father Elias nodded, his mind still preoccupied with the air vent and the haunting voice that had emerged from it. Harold, why do you think the diocese never informed me about the chapel being sold? I was at St. Agnes all those years ago, and my sister was among the missing nuns. Surely someone should have consulted me. Harold returned with 2 steaming mugs, handing one to Father Elias before taking a seat opposite him. The decision came from the bishop's office in Sacramento. I don't think it was handled well, to be honest. After what happened with the nuns, attendance dropped significantly. Then there was that incident with the bell tower. What exactly happened? Father Elias asked, sipping the hot tea gratefully. Structural failure, Harold explained. The chapel was built in the 1920s and maintenance had been minimal. One Sunday morning in 1981, the bell tower developed a large crack. The old bell must have weighed 300 pounds, came crashing down, nearly killed poor Thomas Frell, who was filling in as caretaker while I was laid up with a broken leg. Was anyone hurt? By the grace of God, no. But it was the final straw for the diocese. They declared the building unsafe and closed it immediately. By early 1982, they decided to decommission it entirely rather than pay for repairs. Father Elias frowned. And Silas Redwood purchased it soon after. That's right. Paid cash from what I heard. More than the land was worth, which raised a few eyebrows. But the diocese needed funds for renovations at the cathedral, so they didn't ask questions. What did Redwood do with the property immediately after purchase? Harold's brow furrowed in recollection. Demolished the chapel right away, had a crew out there within days. There were some protests from locals who thought the building could have been saved, but legally, there was nothing they could do. After that, he started landscaping the grounds, but he never built anything substantial on the chapel site itself. Did you notice any unusual construction activity? Anything that might suggest he was building something underground? Nothing obvious, Harold replied, then paused. Although there was a period in 1983 when people reported hearing strange noises at night, machinery running, that sort of thing. And some folks complained about tremors. Father Elias leaned forward, his interest piqued. Tremors? Like earthquakes? That's what the authorities concluded. Minor seismic activity. But it seemed odd that it was localized to that specific area. Some people wondered if Redwood was doing some kind of excavation work. And no one investigated. Further, Harold shrugged. A deputy came out, looked around, found nothing suspicious, and that was that. Redwood has always been well connected, donates to the right causes, knows the right people. The conversation drifted to other topics, the changes in Elden Hollow. Over the years, the declining congregation at St. Agnes, and theological discussions that reflected both men's deep faith. Time passed swiftly, and Father Elias was surprised when his phone rang, breaking the comfortable rhythm of their conversation. Father Maro speaking, he answered. Father, this is Deputy Williams. The officer's voice sounded energized, purposeful. I've made some progress. I spoke with Judge Martinez, who's sympathetic to our concerns. She's granted an emergency warrant for a welfare search based on the reasonable suspicion of unlawful confinement. Father Elias felt a surge of hope. That's excellent news, Deputy. We'll be heading back to Redwood's property within the hour. I wanted to let you know, though I must advise you to stay away for safety reasons. This is now an official police operation. I understand, Father Elias replied, though his desire to be present was powerful. But Deputy, if you do find something or someone, you'll be the first civilian I call, Williams promised. This whole situation began because of your persistence, Father. I respect that. After Harold overheard the conversation, he insisted they should at least be able to observe from a distance, arguing that their spiritual presence might be important if something significant was discovered. With some reluctance, Deputy Williams agreed they could remain in their vehicle at a safe distance, but strictly as observers. An hour later, Father Elias and Harold parked along the public road near the entrance to Redwood's property. From their position, they could see multiple police vehicles arriving, including a forensic van and an ambulance staging nearby, a precaution that sent a chill down Father Elias's spine. Deputy Williams approached their car briefly. "We're going in with the warrant. I've set up my body camera to stream to this channel." He showed them how to access the feed on Father Elias's phone. "You can watch from here, but do not approach under any circumstances. Is that clear?" Both men nodded in agreement, and Deputy Williams returned to his colleagues. They watched as the assembled officers approached Redwood's front door, warrant in hand. Through the phone screen, they observed as Redwood answered the door, his face contorting with rage at the sight of the officers and the document they presented. The audio was muffled but clear enough to hear him protesting vigorously, threatening lawsuits and calls to his attorney. Despite his objections, the officers executed their search warrant, methodically examining the main house while Redwood was kept under supervision in his living room. After approximately 45 minutes, Deputy Williams reported through the body camera that the house and conventional basement had yielded nothing suspicious. Moving on to the forest road and outbuildings now, Williams narrated for the benefit of those monitoring the feed. "Mr. Redwood has confirmed there's a storage shed along the private road connecting his main house to the former chapel site." Father Elias and Harold watched intently as the officers, accompanied by a visibly furious Redwood, made their way along the forest road. The path was well maintained but narrow, winding between ancient trees that created a tunnel-like effect in the fading daylight. After about 15 minutes of walking, the camera showed a modest wooden structure, the storage shed Redwood had mentioned. It was larger than Father Elias had expected, perhaps 20 feet square, with weathered siding and a metal roof. "This is just a tool shed," Redwood could be heard saying. "Garden equipment, maintenance supplies, that sort of thing. Complete. Waste of your time." The officers methodically searched the building, which did indeed contain an assortment of tools, lawn equipment, and gardening supplies. The space was dusty and appeared seldom used, with cobwebs in the corners and a musty odor that one officer commented on. As the search was nearing completion, there was a sudden noise. One of the officers had dropped a heavy wrench, which landed on the wooden floor with an unexpectedly hollow sound. The camera panned down to show Deputy Reynolds kneeling, tapping experimentally on the floorboards. "This section sounds different," he observed, removing his flashlight to examine the area more closely. "These boards look newer than the others." Despite Redwood's renewed protests, the officers began to remove the suspicious floorboards. Beneath them, they discovered a stone staircase descending into darkness. "Mr. Redwood," Deputy Williams said, his voice carrying clearly through the body camera's microphone, "would you care to explain this?" Redwood's face had gone pale, his earlier bluster replaced by tense silence.